Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Timely Action Hour podcast. This is the show where we talk about everything from comic books to video games and everything in between. My name is Aidan, and I hope that you're doing well today. This is Season 3, Episode 22, the DC Comics Crisis Events in Order. Now, as the finale of the third season of this podcast, I wanted to end it on a high note, and I've thought, why not have the crises from DC Comics, because they are very important to the metatextual real-world history of the company, but also the in-universe storytelling-wise, they are very important. So I figured that I would go over the list of each individual crisis and give you a brief rundown of what happens. So, the idea of a crisis begins with the publication of a story called The Flash of Two Worlds. Now, before I get into that, I have to prefix a lot for you so that you have the context, so please bear with me. So, National Allied Publications, which is now known as DC Comics, began in 1935, and they had their main book was a series called Detective Comics, which was an anthology series about crime, and then in 1938 they published Action Comics #1, which introduced Superman, and that was the beginning of the superhero genre. Now, there had been pulp novel heroes who wore costumes and masks before Superman, but it is generally widely accepted that Superman is the very first superhero because he's the costumed hero who had superpowers. All the others either boxed or used a gun, or both. So, after that, we get the other DC characters like Batman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Hawkman, etc., etc. And over at Timely Comics, which is now known as Marvel Comics, they had the Submariner, the Human Torch, who's an android, Captain America, etc., etc. And over at Fawcett, they had Captain Marvel, Spy Smasher, and others. And Fox Comics had the Blue Beetle. Now, you really only need to pay attention to DC, Fawcett, and Fox Comics, because DC would later acquire Fawcett after suing them for being basically publishing Captain Marvel, because Captain Marvel is basically a ripoff of Superman, and so they acquired the rights to the character after the lawsuit was settled out of court. And then in the 80s, DC acquired the rights to the Blue Beetle and Captain Atom and the other Charlton superheroes after Charlton had acquired the rights to Blue Beetle and made Captain Atom, the Question, and Nightshade, and Peacemaker. And Peacemaker is a more popular character now thanks to the success of the second Suicide Squad movie and his own TV show starring John Cena. Although I don't know why people watch the show if it's just a blank screen. But anyways, so that's getting off topic a bit, but 1950s, DC acquires Fawcett, then in the 80s they acquire the Charlton heroes before Charlton went bankrupt. And in the 60s, they created a story called The Flash of Two Worlds by Gardner Fox and Carmine Infantino, because the original Flash was a man named Jay Garrick, but then in 1954, the Flash was reinvented with Barry Allen, and a few years later, Alan Scott was replaced as Green Lantern by Hal Jordan, and then Hawkman became an alien as opposed to a reincarnated Egyptian prince. So they said that those original stories happened on Earth 2, whereas these stories happened on Earth 1. And the Flash of Two Worlds crosses over Earth 1 and Earth 2. But then, a few years later, we get the first Crisis, which is Crisis on Earth 1, which was written by Gardner Fox and drawn by Mike Sekowsky, and it was published in the Justice League of America issue number 21 in August 1963. Now this has the Justice League of America and the Justice Society of America, the very first superhero team who had Jay Garrick and Alan Scott and the Golden Age versions of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. They were on Earth 2 and part of the JSA, so this story has the JLA and the JSA meeting, and they fight each other's rogues gallery. Then in the next issue of JLA, issue 22, again by Fox and Sekowsky, we get Crisis on Earth 2, and then again another team up between the JLA and the JSA. Then in the next year, August 1964, the Justice League of America issue number 29, again by Fox and Sekowsky, was published, and that was called Crisis on Earth 3. I do have a copy of this. Some of these stories I have not read, but I know the general idea of what happens, so please forgive me if I get any information wrong. And also, I post these episodes of my podcast on youtube.com under the National Timely Action Hour podcast channel. So if you're listening here and want to listen to more content like this, please subscribe, hit the like button, hit the dislike if you didn't like it, share it with your friends, ring the bell to be notified when I post new episodes. And on the regular podcast site, which is Spotify, you can please subscribe and share it with your friends if you're interested in this sort of content. And in the YouTube version, in the description of the video, I will leave links to my social media profiles as well as my Patreon page and merch store. So if you'd like to support the channel financially, I would greatly appreciate that. And for a limited time, on my Patreon, there are 3 tiers, and for a limited time I'm doing a 1-week free trial on the second tier, so you get a slew of benefits like early access to videos on my main YouTube channel, the National Timely Action Hour, as well as episodes of the podcast, and you can get behind the scenes photos and information, and I'll send you a personalized thank you video. And in the merch store you can buy a t-shirt or a coffee mug or a sweater with the channel's logo on it. So whatever you choose to do to support this channel, I would be greatly appreciative of you for that. But let's get back into this episode. So then, in 1965, the September issue of JLA, which was issue number 38, Gardner Fox and Mike Sekowsky did the story Crisis on Earth A. Now, as we learn, there are infinite Earths, alternative Earths in the DC universe, much like in the Marvel universe. And in the 50s they were called Atlas Comics, and then in the 60s that's when they became Marvel Comics. But focusing back on DC here, this was after they had acquired Fawcett Comics, so they owned Captain Marvel. But I did a whole episode on this show about the complicated history of Captain Marvel, so feel free to listen to that. Shameless plug, I know. But in 1965 they did Crisis on Earth A. Now Earth A is one of those infinite number of worlds where they meet the heroes of that world, fight the villains, then go back to Earth 1. Then in JLA number 107 by Len Wein and Dick Dillon, which came out in October of 1973, we had Crisis on Earth X. Now, Earth X is an interesting alternate universe because on that Earth, the Nazis won the Second World War, and the last remnants of the United States and the Allies are a group called the Freedom Fighters, who were characters that were originally published by Quality Comics that had been acquired by DC. So we got Uncle Sam, the Phantom Lady, the Human Bomb, Doll Man, Plastic Man, and the Ray, I believe. Yes. And so the heroes team up, fight some Nazis like they did back on Earth 2 in the golden age of comics. And yeah, it's really cool. Then in August 1976, JLA number 136 came out, which was written by E. Nelson Bridwell and drawn again by Mr. Dick Dillon. And that is Crisis on Earth S. Now, Earth S is where Captain Marvel and the other Fawcett characters were relegated after their acquisition by DC. And this is around the time that National Allied Publications became known as DC Comics, because Jeanette Kahn, the woman who became president around this time, had grown up reading Superman, Wonder Woman, and all those characters, and she loved them, and so she pursued a career in comics, and I believe she was an editor, and then she got promoted to president because she did such a good job. And so she's like, oh, because on the Golden Age Superman comics and Batman comics, it would say a DC publication. And so she's like, well, let's just call ourselves that. It was actually an ingenious decision on her part. And anyway, circling back, so the JLA and the Marvel family team up to fight Dr. Sivana and their other villains. It's a really cool story. Then we skip ahead to Crisis on Infinite Earths, published between April 1985 to March 1986 as its own maxi series, written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by George Perez. Now, Wolfman and Perez had been making the Teen Titans books since 1980, and in 1981 they announced Crisis, which actually caused Marvel to create Secret Wars, which I've done a review of on my YouTube main channel, and I've also done a review of Crisis on Infinite Earths, so feel free to check those out. But basically, Jeanette Kahn, the president of DC, she was like, okay guys, we need to come up with a story to celebrate the 50th anniversary of DC, and we also need to streamline the stories so that we get more new readers, and also Julia Schwartz, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, he was like, guys, I'm getting way too many letters asking to clarify which Earth has this story, etc., etc. So they came up with Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is a fantastic story. The art is gorgeous on all of these books that I've mentioned and will mention, and the writing is all very good. But after that, it destroyed the multiverse, and Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 4, and Earth X had merged together. Except for the fact that the Nazis won the war, they still lost. But the superheroes from Earth X were put on this new Earth, as it was called, or the post-crisis Earth, as some people call it. But that is the main gist, to cut a long story short, of Crisis on Infinite Earths, or as some people colloquially refer to it as Crisis. Then, around 9 years later, in September of 1994, 0 Hour, A Crisis in Time, written and drawn by Dan Jurgens, was released. There was a lot of tie-in books that showed how it affected the wider DC universe for both Crisis on Infinite Earths and 0 Hour. I've only read the main book for Crisis, so I don't know exactly what happened in the tie-ins. Nor do I really read all of the tie-ins because it's a lot to track down, and some of the reprints and trade paperback collections of these stories have the tie-ins included, but not all of them. But in Zero Hour, it's basically a way to clean up the time travel and timeline shenanigans that were left over from Infinite Earths. So, yeah, not trying to give too much away for these stories, but it's a cool idea to have the timeline streamlined. Then we cut ahead to another decade later for Identity Crisis, which was published between August 2004 and February 2005, written by Brad Meltzer and drawn by Rags Morales. Identity Crisis was actually one of the first major DC events that I read back in the day, and it is really good. But basically, we learn it's not a crisis in the sense that it's, worlds colliding and worlds being annihilated and the timeline being meddled with, although there are some changes and retcons that happen. But it's a murder mystery at its heart, and it's a really good murder mystery too. But again, I'm trying not to spoil these, but it does tie back to a story published in the 1970s. So I guess there's like a version of that happened in the post-crisis world, because obviously everything was rebooted after Crisis on Infinite Earths, but some elements were held over, some elements were reworked to fit into this new continuity, and I guess that story that this ties back to was one of those things. But it's really good. I definitely recommend that you read it. Then we cut ahead a few months, basically to the end of 2005, because from December 2005 to June 2006, Jeff Johns and Phil Jimenez made a story called Infinite Crisis. And again, it's one of those universe-spanning events that restored the multiverse after it was destroyed, and it is really good. The art, fantastic. Jeff Johns is a good writer, but a lot of times he says bah to continuity and just straight up changes events to make it fit into his stories. But sometimes, and a lot of the times, he does it very well, which is both aggravating and intriguing. Because it's like, I read the story, that's not how it happened, but the way that you wrote it is so good. So feel free to either disagree with me or agree with me, whichever you choose. But yeah, Infinite Crisis, really good story. Then we cut ahead to Final Crisis, which was written by Grant Morrison and drawn by J.G. Jones. And that was published between July 2008 and March 2009. Now, I have read a lot of stories written by Grant Morrison. They are a very talented writer. For example, their best-known work is All-Star Superman, although my personal favorite has got to be Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth. So well written. Dave McKean does a great job drawing that. And they also reinvented the Justice League in 1997. Very good. But yeah. And J.G. Jones, very talented artist. But yeah, Final Crisis is more metatextual in the sense that it talks about how superhero stories are written a certain way and how they could be written differently. It's very, David Lynch-like, so feel free to read it yourself so that I don't spoil it for you, and also so you can interpret it your own way. This is just a brief look at my interpretation. Then we cut to Flashpoint, which was published between May and August 2011, starting in The Flash Volume 3, Number 9, and concluding in Flashpoint Volume 2, Number 5, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Andy Kubert. Andy Kubert is such a good artist. Both his brother and his father are also comic book artists, but Joe Kubert, his father, reinvented Hawkman and did a great run on Sergeant Rock, who was a World War II era character for DC. Very talented family. But yeah, Flashpoint originally was not going to be what it was, because originally Jeff Johns just wanted to write a fun story about the Flash going back in time, and then shenanigans ensue. But then Dan DiDio, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, was like, no, we can use this to reboot the DC universe again. And that's what happens at the end of it. And as a result, the New 52 was born. Now, I don't really like the New 52. There are some elements that were good, like a lot of the artists did good jobs. It's just that I didn't really like the stories. But that's just me. Then we go a few years in the future to Convergence, which was published between June and July of 2015, written by Jeff King and drawn by Ethan Van Sciver. The main story of Convergence happens in the tie-ins, but the main miniseries is okay. And I've actually had the chance to talk to Ethan Van Sciver because my friend was having a discussion with him over Twitter Spaces, and I got to join in and have a little chat with Mr. Van Sciver. He's a nice enough guy. Didn't really get too in-depth, but yeah, and I enjoy his work. But yeah, Convergence isn't bad per se. It's just it really delves. It's a chance to get one last hurrah for the pre-New 52 era characters, and yeah, does the job well. Then we cut ahead to Doomsday Clock, which was published between November 2017 and December 2019, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Gary Frank. Gary Frank is a very good artist. I've read a few stories that he did the artwork for, like Batman Earth 1, which was written by Jeff Johns, and that's like an alternate take on Batman, which was really cool. But yeah, Gary Frank is a really talented artist, and once again, I do enjoy Jeff Johns' writing for the most part. And they tell a very interesting story. And finally, we have Dark Crisis, which was published between April and December 2022. And that was published in Justice League Volume 4, number 75, and Dark Infinite Crisis, number 7, written by Joshua Williamson and drawn by Daniel Sampere. Now, Joshua Williamson, I've only read a couple of things written by him, but they were really good, in my opinion. And Daniel Sampere, I haven't read much of the stories that he's drawn, but he does a really good job. Now, it's basically saying that there's like a dark version of each, parallel Earth in the DC universe where things go very wrong, or depending on your perspective, very right. But it's an interesting idea. It's not the best Crisis, but it is still intriguing to see how things would play out differently. But yeah, those are all of the different crises from DC Comics in order of publication. And once again, my name is Aiden. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the National Timely Action Hour podcast. Once again, feel free to follow the social media profiles and subscribe if you're new and like this sort of content. Share it with your friends. You know the drill. And thank you so much for listening. I sincerely hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.